people would view that survival, sometimes that would be like, they would view that as strength, but they wouldn't view like healing as strength. They wouldn't view their ability to feel their feelings that never had the opportunity to be felt as strong. They wouldn't view asking for help as strong. They wouldn't view listening to their bodies as strong. I could go on that category, right? So for me, this title is really about saying, well, what if it's all strong? And what if we had some better language to say like how it's strong and why it's strong? And to help us navigate how we use the strength.
Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social divisions. Before I tell you about today's guest, I have an announcement. I want to let you know that my book, Small Talk, Learning from My Children About What Matters Most, was just released on audiobook. Small Talk is a spiritual memoir that I wrote a number of years ago about parenting little ones, and that includes parenting Penny, who is our daughter with Down syndrome. And at the time this book was written, she was a little girl with a disability. It's about finding grace in the unexpected conversations that we have with our kids about forgiveness and love and miracles and Santa Claus. And I had the chance to record this book a few months ago. I would love for you or the parents of small children in your life to have the encouragement of listening to it today. So you can find that wherever audiobooks are sold. Turning to the show, Aundi Kolber is my guest on today's episode. Aundi is a licensed professional counselor and author, and today we're talking about her latest book, Strong Like Water. That means we're talking about how to become strong in new ways, how to receive and participate in healing, how to live with compassion toward ourselves, how to carry love in our bodies. Even as I'm saying that right now, I want to return to that idea of carrying love in my body. I know how I feel when I carry fear or anger or discouragement or anxiety. I want to know equally well and return again and again to that place of carrying love and joy. So, on that note, here's our conversation. Well, I'm here today with counselor and author Aundi Kolber. Aundi, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I am excited to talk about your new book, which is called Strong Like Water. And I will tell you, I was really drawn to the title of this book because a friend of mine, right before I found out about your book, had mentioned the way that water can both disrupt and help us grow. She was imagining kind of flood waters, right, that can really not just obviously flood things, but even get trees to be uprooted and almost destroy things and tear things out that need to be done. But there's this sense of water being cleansing and healing and really beautiful. So I don't know your book gives some indication of what you were thinking when you came up with that title, but I thought maybe we could use the title as a way to introduce you as well as the book. So I'd love for you to take that question wherever you want to, but as a means of introduction to your work and to this book that you've written.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to hear that you felt a resonance with that title. I also happen to love the title very much too. I think in many ways, I see that title as an intersection of so many things. Like there's layers to it, and one of the layers is absolutely even like what you mentioned, just the reality that exists, that water is so many things, like in the sense that it can tear things down, it can build things up, it can essentially keep us alive, it can also potentially harm us, take our lives. Like from a biblical perspective, like the metaphors of Jesus as the water of life, but then there's also like passing through water, right? Like that God will be with us as we pass through dangerous waters. And so for me, I think ultimately all of those things have been swirling in me for sure as I thought about this, but truly where what was the thing that brought that together, is the fact that I think it's definitely a combination of my own sense of wanting to have a bigger definition of strength, because my own history and story is that I was always viewed as a really strong person. But part of my story is that I am a survivor of complex trauma from my childhood. And so what people didn't know completely is that that was in many ways all my coping skills. And so my coping skills looked really good. And those were called strong. And what was so hard about that is that it was very lonely to be perceived that strong and not really seen. And at the time, I mean, often people are just doing what they can too. Like they don't always know what's going on. So my own journey of healing, of being a therapist, I specialize in working with trauma and like the nervous system and the body, is that it's like for years have had this gnawing sense of like this ambivalence with how we talk about strength, like simultaneously being like, wow, people go through some wild things and somehow, some way they survive. And also people heal and people change. And it was like, as I would think about those things and I would think about my clients that I work with or folks that I interact with on social media, what I would notice is that people would view that survival, sometimes that would be like, they would view that as strength, but they wouldn't view like healing as strength. They wouldn't view their ability to feel their feelings that never had the opportunity to be felt as strong. They wouldn't view asking for help as strong. They wouldn't view listening to their bodies as strong. I mean, I could go on and on that category, right? So for me, this title is really about saying, well, what if it's all strong? And what if we had some better language to say like how it's strong and why it's strong, and to help us navigate how we use the strength? Because it's like, sometimes we truly need to, like, all that we can do is survive. And I think that that's the grace of God, that we have the capacity to survive. And in that same breath, I can say it's also not sustainable to always be living from a place of survival. Like in multiple ways, it's not sustainable, not the least of which is that physiologically it's not sustainable. And I think that's where this expansive strength idea, I think on so many levels, makes sense, because it's saying we are designed for more. And even when Jesus talks about fullness of life, well, what does that mean? Right? That could it be more? And so to me, water is a beautiful metaphor of the ways that something can adapt, and the ways that, water can change. H2O can change from ice, which is so rigid, all the way to a gas, and it remains H2O. And even that for me, it was just such a helpful metaphor as I thought about writing this book.
There is a lot I'd love to ask you about, and that's the nice thing about a podcast. I get to ask you lots of questions, but I guess where I'll go next is actually towards the end of the book. You give a description of going back to high school and receiving an award and feeling really ambivalent because I think of that strength that you had exhibited in high school and thinking about the strength differently now. So rather than me narrate that story for listeners, could you just talk a little bit about why you were feeling that ambivalence and what happened in that experience of going back to high school, in terms of, it's a little bit of, I guess, fleshing out what you just said about the different types of strength.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking about that. So I believe it was 2018, or maybe it was 2019. I'm trying to remember. Either way,
pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic, I was notified that I was going to be inducted into my high school Hall of Fame, because I remain the highest leading scorer from high school basketball. And so, part of my story is that basketball was a really important part of the ways that I loved basketball, and
Mm.
it gave me a channel to put a lot of intensity that I was not really allowed to feel anywhere else. Growing
Mhm.
up in a pretty, like, I would say profoundly emotionally and psychologically abusive, particularly my father was extremely abusive. And so it's really normal, right? When someone is violating your personhood to have emotion
Yeah.
about that, right? Like that's so normal. But oftentimes in traumatic dynamics, our body perceives it's not safe to feel that here. Because if I do, like if I rage back, what will that what will happen, you know? And certainly there were times that that happened, but there was a lot in me, a lot of intensity that was not safe for me to process
Yeah.
when really difficult things were happening. And so basketball was a way, like I wouldn't have named it this then, but it was like all of that anger and rage and passion and really tenacity I brought with me to sort of this basketball self. And it sort of stoked this fire of like, I mean, I was a very hard worker. I mean, I just went out there like there was a fire in my belly. Like I just went
Yeah.
after things. And I'm in one way, like I'm proud of that. But another way of
Mhm.
that is there's grief with that because that was the only place that that could happen. And so it's like I'm
Right.
simultaneously grateful for that and also
Mhm.
sad that that
Yeah.
was the only place that I could honor it. And so what had happened for me as I continued to develop into adulthood is, I had to set really firm boundaries with my dad to the point where I wasn't able to have contact with him because he was so abusive, and that allowed me to have some safety in some ways. But what also happened was that I began to fear my own intensity. Like I
Mm.
feared things that reminded me of having to be that intense because in the past that had equaled danger. It had equaled, like it had equated to that survival energy, and that was scary
Yeah.
to feel, and particularly for women, right? Like women are socialized to be quiet and often small, and you're too much and you're too loud. And internally, like I had a warrior self who was like, I got some things to say. I want to take up some
Yeah.
space. And so my journey has been to honor and listen and attend to that situation, what I would call situational strength. And over time, as I have the ability to provide the sort of the safety to myself, and through community and other people, my own therapist, like it's definitely not just a solo experience. What can happen is our body, as we have enough safety, our body can metabolize the trauma that's connected
Mm.
to those things that are also good, right? Like
Mm.
my fire was not the problem,
Yeah.
right? What happened to me was the problem.
Yeah.
And so when my body had what it has needed to be able to metabolize the trauma, the fire could remain. And so in a way that felt accessible and not as overwhelming, more from like a place of wholeness. And so when I tell that story and when we think about that story, part of what I had been in that process for some time, like I had been doing that
Mm.
work, and it was like going back to Oregon, going back to this place which was the site where so much had happened, and really like the way, I was being honored for the way that I showed up that was attached
Right.
to so much trauma.
Right.
It was like I looked it in the eye. I looked that pain in the
Mm.
eye in a way that I really hadn't had maybe the chance or the capacity to. And I was able to see that young self with from a different place, like of a place of honor, a place of really getting her, really getting her.
Yeah, I think, I mean, because when I read that, I was really struck by it. I also had an experience in high school, very kind of almost the opposite. My stomach was paralyzed.
Mm,
And so I was shutting down, I think, because of having been taught that you can't have feelings, especially
mm,
ones that are perceived as negative. And so similarly, when I think about kind of returning to the place where I went to high school, where I also was commended for many, many things, I was a
mm,
very, you know, um, good student, and I got lots of awards, and I
mhm,
led lots of things. And,
mhm,
um, and yet I feel very ambivalent about that, because it seems like all those achievements, so to speak, came out of this place of wounding.
mm,
And yet I also look back and think, I mean, it felt very similar, even though it was not an athletic and
mhm,
kind of that same strength. The strength was not being demonstrated in the same way. But I have, as I've begun to heal as an adult from much of that time in high school, I can look back now and say, not only like you were doing the best you can, but also like how amazing that we are able to find ways to
mm.
express some of that passionate intensity, even when it's not safe to do that, in the ways that we learn as an adult. Which I kind of, I guess I want to back up a minute and ask you to speak about. In the book, you have some diagrams and some real exploration of three different types of strength. And you've mentioned situational strength, but could you just give us a little bit of that overview of those, the three different types of strength, and what those might look like in our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. And yes, so in the book, I call, my attempt to describe the expansiveness of strength, I do it through what I call the flow of strength. And so the flow of strength, I imagine that, on one side is that situational strength. So to just be a little bit more specific, that it's that situational strength is really what's happening is that our body is truly perceiving that we are in such a significant, like we're experiencing such a significant threat, or that we are in what feels to us like a life or death situation. And what
Mm-hmm.
happens is a part of our brain, really the top parts of our brain, primarily the prefrontal cortex, it goes offline. And when that happens, so the blood flow is not going to the part of our brain that is really controlling our higher order thinking. It
Mm.
also means that all the other elements, like it's in many ways, it's like our brain goes into a hyper efficiency mode. It's like survival. That's it. So it's even though we have things like where maybe, you're like, oh, I've dealt with this in the past, or like I can do hard things, whatever all these things that you maybe experienced. When we are in survival brain, we don't have access to that. And so
Mm.
truly, it's like our body goes to a default mode of truly like, what is it that is needed in this situation based off of what I'm perceiving that's needed to survive.
Mm.
So for folks who maybe don't have a history of unresolved trauma, that's going to remain true. Like this is true for everybody. Like if you're crossing the street and all of a sudden a car is zooming up and you like really quickly move out of the way, like that situational strength. Like your body is without
Mm-hmm.
a conscious thought deciding, oh my gosh, we got to get you out of the way. Right.
Yeah.
But this gets more complicated when you are a person who's been in situations where there has not been resolved to the past trauma. So this can be true for sure, like in situations of like childhood trauma, but it can also be like in systems. It can happen also in your adulthood. It's like our bodies store that information. And so, like in my story, if I learned that someone getting angry at me could potentially be dangerous, that may move me to situational strength to over accommodate them,
Mm.
even though that situation, in and of itself, maybe even from an outward perspective, maybe wasn't necessarily truly dangerous in the way that we think of it. But because my body was storing the information of what had happened to me in the past, that it was dangerous, we're often reacting from that. So there's a whole, I go into the nuances in the book and how this can play out. But I think it's just important to understand we need situational strength. And this is a part of what it means to be human. We just can't, it's important that we do what we can not to live there and because it's not sustainable. But then on that flow of strength, as our body perceives we have enough safety, enough cues of safety, part of what begins to happen is that our prefrontal cortex begins to come back online. And that is in direct proportion to the safety. Because, like, for example, with the car example, like when you perceive that the threat has passed, that's a cue of safety. And your body begins to be able to be like, oh, wow, that was really close. Oh my gosh, next time I need to like look both ways. And, so the rest of your brain starts to come back online. And then your body's like metabolizing what just happened. And then you kind of, probably in like not too long, your body's going to move through that and that will be over. So, but when we talk about like that transitional strength for folks who a lot of times I'm writing to in the book, what can happen is that it takes some time to, if you haven't had a lot of safety in your life, oftentimes just getting to the point where we are able to connect with safety is a big first step. And I go over that quite a bit in the book. But again, like sometimes that can just be a safe person. Sometimes it's the environment that we're in. And as our brain begins to come back online, part of what's happening is that we're able to observe what's happening in our own body. And this is this is what I say is like, this is where the magic happens, because this is where we begin to have some choice. So like, let's say you come home and, your partner is making dinner and you automatically start to get frustrated. And then, you notice that and you, do a grounding technique to be able to help yourself like, whoa, I'm getting frustrated quickly. It's from that place where we can then be like, hey, you know what? I'm realizing it's been a really long day and I just need like 5 minutes before we touch base, right? Like how different that is when we can bring that awareness. So that's where that transitional strength is sort of like a place of both and. We can be with the pain or the intensity or the old wounding in a way that's sort of different than just reacting. And then as our body has, again, enough safety, we tap into the natural processes of our body that allow us to metabolize. And as we do that, that's like feeling our feelings. And that's being able to, maybe it's like moving our body because we're holding, energy, whatever that might be, we will move towards that integrated strength. And the integrated strength is sort of the place, and that's really what I'm describing in that book, the story from the book is that it's a place of things are coming to completion. The thing that got activated has had the capacity to move all the way through our body so that there's a sense of finishedness. There might be a sense of settledness. There might be a sense of like perspective that you didn't have, even in that transitional strength. So, I think the one other thing that I'll just say about this whole flow is that for many people, they might go along the flow of strength multiple times in a day. And for someone who has a history of trauma, they might be spending more time in transitional or in situational and transitional, partly because their body is still needing more safety and support before those experiences are able to bring to get to completion. And so, I often say like, this is not like a finish line. It's not finish line work. These are all needed. These are all important parts of what it means to be human. And in many ways, it's more an indicator of the amount of safety and support that is present for us.
Well, and that does bring me to one of my questions, which is you had a quotation from Gabor Mate: safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of connection. And you were talking, this is in a chapter called Safety is the Magic Ingredient.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking about people who perhaps are aware that they need healing. They need an ability to move from situational to transitional to integrated strength. Like they're like, yes, I want the flow of strength in my own life. And yet, there's a sense of not being in a safe position from which to heal, right? I mean,
Mhm.
some people are um you've got literal war zones and things like
Yes.
that, but you've also got, ongoing abusive family situations,
Mhm.
or patterns of, we can think of all sorts of patterns of toxic
Yep.
behavior and interactions. And so I wonder how you think about finding safety. Again, I'm thinking about this quotation, not the absence of threat, but the presence of connection.
Yeah.
So does being safe mean I need to know, what does being safe mean? And
Yeah.
how do we get there if we aren't sure whether or not we actually are safe?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to validate, especially in the world that we live in. I mean, the reality is, if when we take the big view, when we take a wide view, there's lots of situations that are unsafe. Like, I would say
Yeah.
the world is not necessarily, like, I would say the world isn't safe. But what I will say is that I think we can build safety. Safety is something that we experience in the moment. Like, safety isn't based off of like um remembering necessarily, though that can help cultivate something in the present. And safety is not even about what will happen in the future. It's about our moment to moment experience of the perception that we have what we need to navigate what's in front of us.
Okay.
And so I would say, I mean, there's a couple different elements to safety, and I'll touch on a couple. One I'll say is that I'm particularly writing from a neurobiological perspective. And I think that's important to understand, because it's like, we could say there's lots of things by various definitions you could say this isn't safe. But when our body has essentially like is picking up enough cues, that we have enough support, that we have enough of what we need, we can stay integrated. And when we can stay integrated, we have the capacity to face hardship in a way that is not available to us in survival mode. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's not that we don't want to address the things that makes the world unsafe, right? Like, I would say that's like a systemic view of how we address safety, and that certainly matters. But this is almost like flipping that on its head and saying, if we get really, really small and particular, like, we sort of need both. Like, we kind of need to come from the top down, but we also need to go from the bottom up. And so
Mm.
my perspective is in a very like very interpersonal perspective about like that, for example, that quote with Gabor Mate, that safety is not the absence of threat, it's the presence of connection. What I
Yeah.
love about that quote is that it has a truth that goes, I love things that are true in multiple ways. You could probably see
Mm-hmm.
the theme. But so on one hand, what that means is, like, here's an example. There has been some research that's been done where kiddos who are in war zones, when
Yeah.
they are in the presence of a caregiver that they have a secure attachment with, they are
Mm-hmm.
less likely to experience PTSD from
Mm.
the experience. So what that tells me is not that we don't want to be like, oh, it doesn't matter, they've got a secure attachment, like so it doesn't matter
Right.
that they're in a war zone. But what it tells us is the power of
Yeah.
relational, like, essentially that's co-regulation. And so when we are in the presence of another, or even honestly nature, because we can co-regulate with
Mm.
nature, or even with God, what begins to
Yeah.
happen is that our nervous system's capacity, it grows. It's sort of like
Mm.
it it almost, you could say it, maybe it doubles or it widens. And so when a nervous system capacity is bigger, we are less likely to go right to that situational strength. So we're staying integrated. And now what's beautiful about that too is that when we have that, right? So we can think of that as a resource, that connection with a person who feels safe to us. What's also happening is that we are internally connected. So again, that Gabor quote is also speaking to that. It's that, like, for example, in our adulthood, when we've had enough care and enough folks around us, we sort of carry that in us. And so we hold the internal connection to provide safety also maybe to parts of ourselves that are still in process. So it's this very both and experience where you can see how these become the building blocks for then creating safety other places, creating safety in with two people, but then what does it look like for that to begin to build into a family, and then to begin to build into a community, and then to be to build those ways. And so it's, again, it's not that there are not dangerous things that are present. It's, can we also give ourselves and give others as much as we're able what they need to navigate the thing that feels threatening, because that will allow us to move through it in a way that's not possible with situational strength.
Yeah. So one of the things that's lovely about your book is how you do at the end of each chapter say, okay, let's actually think about what this might mean in your life. And you're very careful not to say this is a prescriptive, all you have to do is ABC and you're going to, check some boxes and be made well or something. But at the same time, you give some really tangible, practical exercises for developing. I love the way you just talked about that. Like there's going to be danger in our lives, and that's going to be true emotionally and relationally and sometimes physically. And that does not in and of itself mean that we cannot be healing and growing. Although there may be times, of course, when we need to literally just get out of the unsafe situation. So let's be clear about that. And I guess, could you give us one or two of those grounding practices, of some of the ways in which you or your clients have been able to begin to develop more than situational strength, to begin to expand that, capacity for remaining present to ourselves and, not having to just flee from it all?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the first things that I do take this concept of safety very seriously. And again, there's with lots of nuance to that. But part of why I always start with usually a grounding practice. And this is because basically we can't access things that feel a little more complicated or a little bit more advanced or nuanced when we're like out here, like our nervous system is like, I'm in it. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times, especially for folks, if this is new to you, this is going to be partly the practice of just even noticing, like if you can catch yourself before you're all the way out of situational strength, that's when it's like ideal. But anytime that you're like, oh, this feels like too much, that's a sign, right? Like that's a sign that you need a practice. So grounding is really, it's the practice of using our five senses to come back into the immediacy of the moment, because God willing, the present moment is safe. And like you said, there are times when the present moment isn't safe. And in those moments, really our priority actually is then to figure out what you need to do to get to literal safety, to get out of that situation. So what I'm speaking about here is not situations so much that you're needing to like escape, but that you're recognizing this is disproportionate to the moment. So when we recognize that, A great one that I love to share, and there's lots of ways to do this, but just honestly, especially as we're coming up on summer, to get outside and to use your five senses. If it's possible, like take off your shoes and like stand in the grass. Notice what it feels like to have your weight bear down on your feet. What does the texture of the grass feel like? What are you seeing around you? And as you do that, bring in the details. Like, this is not a checklist activity. The practice is the work. Like the noticing is the work. That is the cue of safety. So it's like noticing what you're seeing, noticing, can you smell anything? Can you hear anything? Is there anything that you're tasting? Oftentimes I'll say the more activated that you are, often the more time you may need to spend doing something like a grounding activity, which is, again, I think what we know from nature is that it provides so much of a soothing sensory experience. And that's why I like, if you need to do this inside, that's great. But honestly, I find it to be the most effective if you can get outside. And so just doing something like this, I think oftentimes gives us enough cues to safety to where we're able, that prefrontal cortex begins to come online. And we're like, oh, wow, I can't believe I just said that to my child. I'm realizing like, okay, what happened for me at the grocery store was like, whoa, that was a little wild. This is where oftentimes we haven't even been really aware of what we're doing, because we're sort of in like, we're just in the mode of like, this is kind of bonkers, So as that's beginning to happen, it's gonna look a little different. But one practice, well, I'll share two more practices. One is just basic self-compassion. And this may not feel accessible to everyone at first. So just want to say, like, if you're hearing this and you're like, that's really hard, give yourself grace. Like, that's okay. But what you might consider is, if someone in your life that you feel tenderly toward was really struggling, what might you say to them? And as you think about that, what do you notice in your body? Do you notice a softening? Do you notice words that come to your mind? Do you notice like a desire to be like, hey, it's okay. Everybody has bad days. Like, it's okay. Sometimes we say things that we don't mean. And yeah, like we need to make amends, but like, it's okay. I'm here with you, right? When we think about that, taking a moment to notice what that feels like in our own body is an important part of the practice. And then if possible, could you visualize yourself next to that person that you're encouraging? And would it be possible to offer just a little bit of that compassion to yourself? And when you do, what comes up for you?
Yeah. Go ahead. I think you had one more you're going to share, and then I'll comment.
No, that's okay. Yeah. And then, so that's another one. And I think for a lot of folks, self-compassion is not something that always happens right away, and that's okay. But it's just good to know that that's a possible route or a practice that's available. And then the third practice is something that I coined. I call it art. And it came from a place of really believing that God is a master artist, and we are art designed by this master artist. And so art stands for attune, respond, and tend. And attune is really, again, this is something that over time often deepens. But part of what we're just doing is we're bringing our attention to our body. If it's helpful, you can think of like, sometimes I'll say, you can just picture like a red laser going over your body. And what are you noticing? Like, what sensations are there? Is there an emotion that's coming up? Is there an overall sense of what needs to happen? Because what we're doing is we're just looking for information. And sometimes we don't always have the words for what that means. And that's okay. We're just trusting that our body holds a lot of information. And we will come to understand what that means. As we do have a sense of what that means, that takes us to the next one, and that's respond. So a really basic example of this is like, you tune into yourself and you're like, oh, I'm thirsty. And like, I've been thirsty for an hour. Like, a response to that is like going to get something to drink, because things like this, they seem like basic, but you would be surprised How many people never got the opportunity to learn how to attune and respond to their own needs?
Mm-hmm.
And that last one is tending. And I think about that like, okay, I've gone inward, I've responded to the needs that I'm aware of. And now I think of it almost like when I take my kids to the park. Like they might go and play on the playground, and I could even be talking to someone and I could keep an eye on them. But like I could
Mm-hmm.
still have a conversation with someone, and that generally will work. And I think that's a little bit like what it's like with our bodies. Once we've met those basic needs, we can just sort of like we're keeping an eye, but we have some more capacity to turn outward and say, okay, well, what else is going on? Who else? Like what's happening in the world? What's, we're tending, but we're also aware of what's happening outside of us too. And that cycle allows us to be, to love people, to be present also to others. And so that's another practice folks might consider.
Thank you for all of those. And again, there are even more in the book. And I'm thinking about the role of the body, which has come up a lot already in this conversation. My family, we're getting ready for a move, and we're actually moving back. My husband is the head of school at a boarding school, and he and I both went to boarding school. So we are literally, he's this summer going to be becoming the head of school at the place where we went to high school. So again, your book resonated for me because of that idea of like going back to high school and having ambivalent feelings about it. And I'm going to go live there. So I'm really processing both this sense of like excitement, and it's great that we are, my rational mind is able to tell me like, this is amazing. It's been 30 years. We've experienced so much growth and healing. How exciting to be able to go back to this place that had both wonderful and hard things and bring the healing we've experienced, blah, 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 blah. And I have found that my right eye is twitching a lot. So I have really learned in, the last, decade, that when I have these even very subtle signs through my body, to stop and say, okay, what am I not paying attention to, right?
Yeah.
What am I not attuned to? In the same way that I might not notice that I'm hungry or thirsty, I can pretty easily not notice that I am afraid or anxious, especially when my brain is telling me, you don't need to be. It's safe now. I mean, and on some level, but I need more than my rational brain to tell me that. Like I need my heart. I need to go into God's presence with that. And that's what I've been learning. So every time my eye twitches, I'm like, oh, I am scared of the future. Like there's some part of me that is afraid of what's ahead. And that's okay. But I also don't need to just like march along with a twitching eye, right? I can
Right.
pause and, bring in various ways, peace to my body, but also to my spirit, and acknowledge that, yeah, some of this feels scary, but let's think about what we've learned over these years, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go into all the details, but what I wanted to ask you was just to speak to the idea of the signals our body might give us that tells us, like almost as like a starting point for healing, but also as I'm also thinking about completing the stress cycle. You write about this, which is kind of an end point for healing, right? So there's like, I think there are ways in which our body maybe triggers, like in a good way, signals a need, like you need to pay attention to this, but also the way in which we need to bring our body and not just our thoughts into any sort of kind of healing process that we go through. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that makes so much sense, like what you're naming, about how that might be affecting you. And even that there's I hear the ambivalence, even as you describe it in your body. Like that there's a cognitive acceptance, and that there's maybe something deeper, right? That is below the cognitive, right? So if we think about the brain sort of from the bottom up, that it is lower. And so I think that this is a great example of the ways our bodies speak to us. And I think it's wonderful that you're even noticing. And
Thank you.
yeah, it is. It is, because I think, I've been with people, and I can like there's this term that Dan Siegel has, and he says it's called nervous system contagion. And this is the idea that our nervous system states can influence the states around us. And essentially, when we begin to have an awareness of that, if we can stay regulated, it can go the other way too, right? So if we're in the presence of someone who's really anxious, it's easy for their anxiety. We begin to feel that in our own body. If we can begin to notice we're starting to feel anxious, we can stay grounded, and we can't control them, but we can at least stay with ourselves, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So when I hear that, it makes me think of folks I've been with, and I can feel the anxieties coming off their body. And I might say, I'm wondering if I'm noticing that you may feel a little anxious right now. And they'll say, I'm not anxious. I'm not anxious at all. Right. And they're like,
right.
And I say that like not in a critical way, but I think oftentimes like maybe the narrative that they have in their body is or in their mind is very different than what they're experiencing in their body. And that disconnect, right, like might be, others might be experiencing them as anxious, but they themselves are not, they don't have the awareness to recognize it. And so even being able to say, oh, I'm noticing that my eye is twitching and I'm curious, and it's feeling like that might be connected to this upcoming move. Even in a small way, I want you to know that that's a form of integration. That awareness, what you are literally doing is bringing together that left hemisphere, that high left hemisphere that is narrating a cognitive reality with probably like a low right, which is where our body sensations are sort of registered. And in many ways, the goal of healing is integration. I mean, it's shalom, it's wholeness. That is what healing essentially is. And so that doesn't take away the twitch, right? But I think it is a good first start, because what you're doing is you're opening the conversation. And then there's, I think, a lot of different opportunities, because once there's connection, once there's some integration, the conversation could look a lot of different ways. It might be something like, to the part of yourself, like sometimes I'll have folks, like clients, like if your twitch could say something to you, what would it say? What would it want to tell you? And they might speak on behalf of what's happening in their body. And what we're doing there, again, is it's a form of integration, but it's also a form of, there's a bit of a processing that's happening, right? Like let's just say that twitch is like, well, I'm really scared because this seems like it's going to be really hard. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but whatever that is. And then from that, completing the stress cycle, there's a lot of different ways. Like that's probably like a little bit of a compassion-based approach. If we're going more from like, especially a body-centered approach, we might, sometimes I'll have clients like zoom in like to the awareness of what they're feeling in that part of their body. And then I'll say, if your body could make any movement it wanted to right now, what would it want to do? How would you want to move when you think about what that part of your eye is holding for you? Is there a movement that would express something that wants to happen here? Because that's sort of the theoretical idea behind completing the stress cycle, is that similar to like situational strength, there is a spark in our body. There is an intensity that wants to be discharged. And essentially, like, especially somatic therapy essentially says our body, we can help facilitate through the listening and awareness of the sensations. We can facilitate the discharge of the energy that hasn't been able to move all the way through. Right. So whether this is for you or for someone listening, a lot of times, this is not my phrase, but I think it's a beautiful sentiment. Like, movement is medicine. But it's not just movement like I'm throwing paint against the wall. It's like, if we can do those things, like first I'm getting grounded, And then I'm listening. And then it's like I'm cueing into that deep inner voice. What wants to happen here? Do I want a slow walk? Do I need a dance party? Do I
Mm-hmm.
need to give myself permission to, I know folks can't see this, but like I'm starting to like sway. Like there are different ways, because this is the way our body is designed to move energy through, is in partnership with movement. And so that would be my encouragement. I mean, I talk about some different elements within the book too. But I think being able to sort of compassionately attune and to sort of say, well, what do you need? What would that be like? And we can
Yep.
experiment. It's like, it doesn't have to be like, I'm going to try this one thing. And if it doesn't work, it's more like, well, I tried this and that wasn't it. I tried this, that felt a little bit better, and this, I think, is that process of deepening the listening too.
Mm. Thank you. I do love the permission, which some of us need, to actually stop and just pay attention and to trust ourselves, right? To trust that if my body can signal that there's something wrong, it also might be able to tell me what would make it right. Like that sense of, what do you need right now? And even saying, and are you willing to honor yourself and your own needs enough to experience that?
Mm.
There's a place in the book where you write that we are invited to carry around in our bodies a love that does not disappoint us or put us to shame.
Mm.
And I thought that was a beautiful way to even speak to that sense of integrated healing that you, I think, are really, writing about throughout the book and talking about today, where our personal selves, right? Like our mind, our bodies, our spirits are integrated, which allows us to have a sense of integrated peace and connection with both God and the natural world and the people around us and our communities and our societies. And so that does get back to that idea of the shalom of God, of that wholeness and healing. So I thought I'd kind of land us in that place of this idea that we are invited to carry our around in our bodies a love that does not disappoint us or put us to shame. Is there anything that you would add just in terms of what it looks like to carry around that love, to do that in our bodies?
Yeah. Well, I am glad that line resonated with you. I think that is probably, one of the deep beliefs, like values, that undergirds the work that I do, that, like all of this work is, there's like a mutuality and a reciprocity that exists within healing. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
it's like everything that you named, like all these different ways in which shalom occurs, that it's not, we in and of ourselves matter, but the nature of wholeness is that there's an abundance, and that there is
Right.
there is a sense of deeper connection. And I love that, because I mean, even neurobiologically, this is a reality. Like neurobiologically, like the most, secular of, neuroscientists would agree that like integration is the work, right? And it's like I love when truths are so true that they ring like a bell, that they just like they extend outward. And so, yeah, I mean, I think what I would just want to say too to your listeners is like, wherever you are on that journey of like that flow of strength, wherever you begin, one, I think there's lots of on ramps. Whether you're spending lots of times in situational strength, there's on ramps to get into the flow. If you're spending more time already in transitional, that's beautiful. What does that look like to honor that and to allow that God-given body to do the work that it's designed to do, to bring that compassion and curiosity? And that what really makes me so excited, in the book, I call it compassionate resourcing. And really, that's all these little, we could call it, these are cues of safety. These are moments of goodness. These are the ways, these are the things that bring us towards integration. I think, when you talk about that quote, it's like those things are building the template that you speak of, like the love that does not disappoint.
Mm-hmm.
Every like and we could talk about that from a faith perspective, but we could also just talk about it from a place of secure attachment, meaning this belief that people are like, there are some things that are bigger than pain. There are things that are bigger than trauma, and that those leave a mark in us and on us in ways that pain and trauma never could.
Thank you for that. And I think that is certainly, I mean, I'm thinking about the name of this podcast, Love is Stronger Than Fear. And just that sense that, especially for anyone who's experienced that deep trauma, or even, even less deep trauma, shallow trauma, whatever that might mean. That probably doesn't exist, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
I'm hearing you. Yes.
We've all experienced things that cause fear, and it's easy to live in that place. And yet there's also something incredibly healing and true to dig down into that deep love. That's even, I had a yoga teacher who at one point, when I was frustrated that I had more healing to do, she was like, the healing doesn't stop until the love goes deeper than the wound. And I hear you saying something similar, just that sense of like, when we are being called to more healing, it is because we are being called to more love. Like, it's like that's where we land, and that's what we are invited into and invited to carry around with us. So thank you for the work that you're doing to help us access that love that we can carry around with us at all times.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was just a wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm really, really glad we got to talk today. Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. Once again, I do want to remind you to check out my book, Small Talk, on audiobook. And also, we rely on you to spread the word. That's actually true about the audiobook. It's also true about this podcast. And spreading that word happens every time you share this with a friend, if you give this podcast a rating or a review. It's also helpful to me just for you to reach out to me and let you know what you're thinking about these conversations. I hear from some of you, and I really love it. So thank you for that. My email is amyjuliabeckerwriter@gmail.com. I always want to give thanks to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, for producing the podcast. And finally, as you go into your day today, I hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.